as Brian suggested, there's a already published version of this paper, which is much more extensive than today's presentation will be. There was a conference in Luxembourg 2.5 years ago, which involved something that might have been 50 or 60 scholars presenting papers on these exact same subjects. And I was invited to present on the New World Dutch Cultural Hearth, which I will begin by explaining what that is. Okay, here's a map of the northeastern United States, and we have, let me find it here.
Right in the middle.
Yeah, okay. So we have New York, and then what's conventionally known as New York there. And I'll run through these quick just to give a fake sense of an animation. The first slide with the purple outline is where the Dutch occupied legally the Hudson Valley and adjacent areas, including the Long Island Sound. The areas that are hashed there are the areas where they had effectual settlement. So there were plenty of areas that they claimed legally that they didn't actually occupy. And then after ceding the territory to England in the late 17th century, the area of effectual occupation actually continued to grow because the English didn't really move into the area. They pretty much left the Dutch to themselves. And so this actually continues until after the Revolutionary War, where where folks who had initially come from England begin to work their way westward into New York State. And the Dutch actually moved to the north and actually as far as Ontario. I wanted to give you that sense because that's the largest span is the area that I'm talking about. That's my study area. Here we can see just an emphasis of the types of materials that are available. Close at hand, we have 2 brick regions, large clay banks, a couple of limestone, and a red sandstone region. These really affect the architecture that you see so that some of the houses look more or less Dutch or more German, or depending on where you are. These last shots are in the city of Albany, where you have some fairly classical Dutch buildings. The survey was inspired by the fact that there were a lot of building traditions that were kind of going by the wayside. A lot of friends of mine who had started working in the 1970s in timber framing and started working in the preservation movement, which is young to the United States. These people were retiring, and I wanted to collect their stories because there's no really sophisticated literature of all the different practices that are being done in the United States insofar as Apotropaic beliefs is concerned. So I showed you here, these are our recent events here where the topping out ceremony, a tree is attached and the signatures are put on the highest beam in a steel structure. It's also done with wood frame. Secreting a box in a large cornerstone, and that's typically coins of the day are very frequently associated with that. Of course, we have no shortage of the use of shoes as well, and those really, before I began this study, in terms of just collecting data, folks were willing to show me their shoes and that they had found during renovations, but they really could offer nothing else in terms of what might be practices in the region. Manning, in 2012, did a study generically across the United States. Her work was mostly concentrated on the eastern seaboard, however, and these are the examples that she collected for her doctoral thesis. We have some examples here. I put this slide in just to give a sense, and I'm sure you all know, the long-term history of using the daisy wheel, which when I recently showed this in preparation for this talk. I showed it to some people in my hometown, and I wanted to give them a sense of the long-standing history of the practice. So we have here a few examples. You know the type, they're really all just the same as they are here. We find them on framing and, as here, doorways as well. So this example here is on the door. We also find them on ironwork, in particular door and window hardware, and also on angle irons or tiebacks. And here I was speaking with Brian earlier, an example in New England, they use the daisy wheel very frequently on tombstones. And in the New World Dutch cultural hearth, we find them associated with women's furniture, blanket chest, spoon racks, some other boxes, matchboxes, things like that. And so that in the New World Dutch cultural hearth, it seems to be a practice that's not only associated chiefly with passages, if we consider the grave a passage itself, but also with things that are specifically associated with women and women's possessions. Another symbol that we find not nearly as commonly, but it does occur, is an X, in this case here, shown in brick on the front of a house. And it's also emblazoned in this kind of twist work on each of the mantles of the house as well. And these have been found on a large number of English firebacks, but also in this example here, one in Clairvaux in Luxembourg. Again, this design, the X, is found in multiple contexts. A lot of times it's on a urn. And then here, a witch post, possibly suggesting an older precedent for the practice. We have here an example of them used here on wall holdbacks. And one of the other, and it's a little more difficult in the United States because there is absolutely no collected folk literature telling you what people are believing when they're doing this. And so the process that I have to go through is basically look at a lot of buildings and start to see patterns. I mean, in both senses of the word. And one of those patterns is the use of diamonds, particularly in association with fireplace mantles. I have no explanation of what these could have meant to people, but here are a few examples. Let's see, diamonds in the ends here, and this is more frequent, and then here, and another piece of women's furniture. And in this case here, the diamonds are up on both sides there. These houses are all, those three examples are all 18th century houses. Another motif, which seems particularly associated with door entry hardware, and also in facades, is the use of hearts. So here we have latches, things like that. And these two houses here, 17th century house and a 1762 house here, where it has a heart emblazoned on the side, and then here we have hearts worked out in tile on the face. I think these have some protective intention, not just a sentimental one, although typically in New York they've been interpreted as having only a sentimental association. But we see them frequently in connection with the 6-point star and with diamonds, and so you have on these pieces of women's furniture, we have the combination of the diamond, the star, and the heart. Here's an example from the 1930s in Brooklyn, which has two of the daisy wheels on the front worked in stucco. Probably the most recent example that I have found in the area, because most of the visible practice of these habits really stopped by the mid-19th century. And just as another comparison, here's a box I bought in Poland about 20 years ago, which has the device on. We see use of interesting symbols, but more often than not, see the daisy wheels on date stones. Some unusual, unexplained lettering. There very frequently we'll find a combination of X's alternating with crosses. And then in these cases here, this one right here on a house from 1711 and this barracks in a fort built in 1759. Two examples of what appears to be letters just written over each other. And I haven't been able to pull them apart. I've tried on a few occasions, so I don't know what they might be intending, but I believe they have some sort of charm purpose. This was on the underside of a hearth beam in the house, and this is on the gable end wall on one of the barracks, built into the stone wall at a height that you can't see from the ground. Another case here, this was concealed in a window well in a house. It looks sort of like a pitchfork suspended from a beam, I'm not quite sure though. We have a few examples of human heads buried in architectural context. This example here was found in the foundation of a house built in 1710. This is a scholar named Gay Mallon who's reconstructing the face. An example of a house built in 1812. I was working on the renovation of it, and over the main fireplace, when we opened up the ceiling, this small sculpture, which is only that tall, fell out of the ceiling, which I think in that it might be just kind of an avatar for a human head, perhaps, if that was the intention there. And then a third example where in 1870 a human head was found in an 18th century house that has been demolished. The context suggests that it wasn't a recent crime or something like that. Found in the New World Dutch cultural hearth, we found only one example so far of a horse skull being buried, or not buried, being secreted in a house, in this case here, between the beams in an attic. The house was built in 1796. Only this one area between the beams was open, so we don't know if there are more than just the one example. And here's just an Irish example. Oops. A couple of examples of sticks or rods have been discovered. This one here, 92 centimeters long, and has its ends both rounded. This I found when this building was being renovated. I found jammed between the roof boards and the top of the truss, so it had to have been installed while the building was being constructed. Another example found in a wall pocket recently, and this one here has got a nail attached to it on its pointy end. In some ways, we're still at a point where we don't have enough of any of these sort of more unusual examples to kind of get a sense of where they're frequently found and that kind of thing, because in the United States, really, most people aren't attuned to even looking for these things. So, in this case here, the Queenman's house where the human skull was found, under the hearth, there was a British coin from I think it's the 1760s, and then an identical coin was found in another family member's house about a mile away, under the threshold. In a couple of cases, I have found carved pieces of wood carved to appear to be knives. In both cases, these were buried under the floor in basements. And although in New England, we do have a kind of a stronger tradition of the Bellarmine jar and the witch bottle, in the New World Dutch cultural hearth, we've only found really one witch bottle per se. And we do find the Bellarmines, but this is the only intact example that's been found so far, and all the other ones are fragmentary, and it's not possible to tell. They're not in pure archaeological context, and so we can't really say if they were used for that purpose. Another bottle, which might be a witch bottle, was found in the gable end wall of a house that was renovated about 1840. And this is a ginger beer bottle, like the other example. And it has not been opened, so I can't tell you what it is. But the owner believed that it had turpentine in it. One of the things that makes the study of the material culture in the New World Dutch cultural hearth interesting is that there was a strong presence of Native Americans. Even today, in 2 areas, we have reservations. And also in 1614, slavery was introduced. And so this actually creates a Creole culture in the region. I'll introduce some of the features of magical beliefs in the Native Americans. They include an extensive use of the colors blue and white. In this case here, these are from shells. They call it black and white, however, and they attribute magical practices to it. They also make extensive use of spirals, which to them is a cosmogram. And so we have some examples here. It's a petroglyph in the middle Hudson Valley. This found in a Native American site. It is reworked metal. The Native Americans, they traded heavily with the Dutch, and they would buy kettles. That was the most frequent thing that they purchased, aside from some of the religious trade goods. But they would take the kettles and they would put them to their own purposes. They would fashion points out of them, tools that they needed, and they would rework some of them. In this case here, this is kind of a recurved ring from a kettle, worked into a spiral. And also, there's a very strong belief in the agency of quartz crystals. Now, in New York State, these are found in one area, and that is in the center of New York State. And so they're approximately 90 miles away from the study area. So they've traveled to get there, and when you find them, it's a clear sign of an intentional deposit. And we find them sometimes, in this case here, those 2 examples were found in the city of Albany, in the corner of what had been a trading house for the Native Americans. And that dated to about 1624, I think it was. I mentioned slavery. It was introduced to New Amsterdam, New York City today in 1626. This is the Lent House, which still exists in Brooklyn. And recently, above this area here, this is a little kitchen and a laundry area. This was, initially, it was a slave house. It doesn't exist anymore. But found underneath the floorboards, the second floor level, in this area that's very difficult to get to, but which appears in the early 18th century to have been occupied by enslaved people. We found these examples of slipware, slip-decorated pottery, all of which had these X's in them. There was also a, between the joist above the first floor, under the floorboards, there was a kind of a star pattern made out of corn cobs. It's harder to see here, but these also in the bases here have these X's, which have been interpreted as a cosmogram that comes from Africa. And these examples, these 2 examples, come from South Carolina, so it gives you a sense of the extent of the use of that device among the enslaved people in America. So because of the long period of contact between these 3 groups of people, we have a lot of crossover. So we have some Native American moccasin shoe deposits. This one here from 1785, found in that Queen's house that had the coin deposit. In this case here, a shell ornament with a star device on it, believed to have been manufactured by a Dutch settler and traded with a Native American. It was found at a burial site. Also with people who were enslaved, we have here the recurrence of the colors of the blue and white in this case here. And this house initially built in 1653. There's a cache in the basement where the slaves lived. And behind a fireplace, there were a large number of these blue and white beads found. They were disarticulated, but there was also in a pocket behind a ladder stair going up to the first floor, there was what's known as an inkisi bundle, which is a spiritual bundle sometimes carried by shamans in Africa, very similar to some of the bundles that have been shown today in other contexts and other cultures. So I'll go through here some of the connections. We have here in that bundle bent nails, which have obvious provenance in Europe, right? We have fragments of stoneware which have a blue spiral on them, and another one here. And then we have, and this is a kind of a degraded example, but it's a quartz crystal. Another example of this kind of overlap, recently found in this 18th century former parsonage in the middle Hudson Valley. On one of the fireplaces, this one in the basement, there's this cosmogram pricked out on one of the jambs. And then bent nails, fragments of pipes, quartz crystals, and blue beads were found underneath the hearthstones. And that area was once specifically occupied by the family slaves. Okay, another type of intentional deposit has been found in a few cases in the cities of Albany and in New York. This is in 1797, the city suffered a fairly extensive fire, nothing like the London fire of 1666, but several blocks burned, and they decided to reorganize the street pattern. And so because of that, archeologically, when we went to examine them, there were areas, because these blocks had subsequently in the 20th century been cleared, there were intact deposits dating to 1797. They just simply filled in the lots, raised the grade because this is by the river, so they raised it by 5 feet, so everything was encapsulated. And we found there a couple of small barrel, or about this big, barrel deposits, which have personal items. They have bent pins, things like that in them. And in both cases, and in the New York City example, they're found under the basement floor in a cellar kitchen occupied by slaves. So here you can see this is a kaolin pipe with initials on it. This is a small ceramic marble with a bee crudely worked into it. Here's another example that was discovered in 1869, which describes it encountering one of these at that time. I'm going to end with two presentations of assemblages, things where, houses where multiple components and multiple practices were found in one place. In this case here, we've already seen this one example. There are two date stones in the house. One of these has got a cross on it. The other one has a pointed star. Here we have here on the main stair, and the house was built beginning, I think, in 1710. That's the oldest part, and is from 1710. And there's a 1760 face. So on this stair on the side, the stringer. The owner allowed me to scrape back, and we revealed these. At the top of the stair, there are painted compass rose and some other initials. I do not know what those intended. Of course, the regular retinue of shoes was encountered, a lot of them in this particular house. And then this unidentified artifact, which has got a little bit of, it's a little window in it.
It's like a planchette.
It dates to 1710 or before. We don't know what it was. It was found in the wall in an undisturbed context. It's about this long. I don't know. It seemed like it might be used, to look through, perhaps. I have no idea. Prognostication. And then this building happens to be my office, and it was built in the early 1790s. So I've had a lot of time to kind of poke around and look for things. We know that it was built for a family that never had children. And so this child's shoe found in an interior wall couldn't possibly have been owned by a member of the family. In this case here, we've got some marks only recently discovered with scraping down a door. I'm not quite sure, but I mean, none of them make a star, but they are kind of connected circles that keep kind of repeating. And then in an area of the house that was modified about 1830, or 1820 rather, under the mantle was found this intentionally broken transfer printed ware plate, which has even seeing it today, it's a fresh break. It was intentionally broken. And then it was deposited with other sharp objects, a quill pen, a broken comb, and some pins. This fireplace also features those diamonds on it again.